Thank you very much for having me tonight. Before I start, I would like to invite everyone to take a deep breath. Feels good, right? Now imagine you can't do that. See, for me, as a passionate scuba diver, the fear of not being able to breathe is always pretty real. Oxygen is vital, and breathing is our body's way to take up the oxygen, where it then gets circulated around in our cardiovascular system. See, unfortunately, the system sometimes fails. And if you think about it, diseases we are really scared of, like heart attacks and strokes, they all boil down to one thing: lack of oxygen. It is like part of our body can't breathe. Now, paradoxically, our skin, which is really the closest to the outside world and the outside air, often suffers first from lack of oxygen because of poor blood supply. And this can cause all sorts of problems with skin health and wound healing. You know, every single step in wound healing requires oxygen, starting from fighting off the infections in the fresh wound, building new blood vessels and tissue, as well as scar formation. In fact, if there's no blood and oxygen supply to the wound stops healing. This is particularly a problem in elderly people or people with chronic diseases such as diabetes. About 2% of the Australian population have a chronic non-healing wound at any one time, and the annual wound care costs are in the billions. See, the problem is that current oxygen therapies for chronic wounds involve hyperbaric chambers. You know those big pressurized boxes where they put people under high oxygen levels? You probably heard about athletes receiving this treatment for speedy recovery. The issue is just it's very inconvenient and very expensive, roughly about $100,000. So not everyone gets it. So I went to visit hospitals and I talked to clinicians and I talked to patients and I asked them, what do you actually need to fix this problem? Well, it turns out the holy grail would be a wound dressing that can supply oxygen to speed up wound healing, which is directly correlated to scar formation, is antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, anti-itch, and doesn't stick to the wound. Doesn't sound very complicated, does it? Now, I know that trees get all the credit, but did you actually know that about 70% of oxygen is produced by single-cell plants, so-called microalgae? You probably know them as superfoods. Now, here's a thought. What if we bring the oxygen producers closer to where the oxygen is needed and create some sort of artificial symbiosis? Well, it turns out Mother Nature's already ahead of us. So on one of my dive trips up in Cairns, I met this little guy. He's a sea slug, and he's the perfect scuba diver because he carries microalgae in little pockets of his skin and makes photosynthesis and produces his own oxygen. Can you imagine what we could do with this? So I bounced the idea of the clinicians to use microalgae for continuous oxygen supply, and their reaction was actually quite interesting because it went from, this is completely insane, to, this might actually work. Interestingly, it was one of the patients who came to me and said, you know, we have been putting plants on wounds for centuries. He's got a point, right? And so we assembled a unique team of experts with expertise in a broad range from regenerative medicine at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, antibiotic experts in our Centre for Superbug Solutions, material scientists from UQS-AIBN, clinicians with a background in hyperbaric chamber therapy, and people like me who are into algae. And we figured if we combine forces, we can incorporate medically safe microalgae into a gel sheet that could supply oxygen to a wound. So we went into the lab and we did some preliminary experiments, and the data looked really, really promising. And we came up with a little prototype. See, the algae can't go anywhere. And if you imagine a little flexible LED light, maybe even driven off your iPhone, can supply oxygen 24/7. We've also found out that the cost of such a dressing could be as little as $10. That would make it accessible to everyone and also affordable for everyone. Now, but even better, because we already know that oxygen supply improves infections in surgery wounds as well as improves antibiotics. So we could actually implement it as a proactive measure. Now, if you think my idea could fly, I would like to invite you to join me on this journey. Because to actually convince doctors, grant agencies, companies that this works, we need to create hard data. And for that, we need seed funding. With about $20,000, we could actually identify the best algal concentration for the perfect oxygen. With another 20,000, we can turn our gel sheet into a dressing. And another 20,000 on top would allow us to do antibacterial testing. You know, in Germany, where I'm from, the word scientist translates to knowledge creator. And your gift would allow us to do exactly that, create knowledge. Photosynthetic oxygen therapy is just in its infancy, and it's a completely new field, and no one knows where the edges are. You know, this could just be the start of a completely new technology that could range as far as photosynthetic oxygen supply to organs. I know it sounds crazy at first, but so did a lot of things before we started to imagine. Look, the IMB is the place where we dare to imagine and where imaginations become reality. This could just be one of them. Now, what do you think?